He's won a Pulitzer Prize, and he's written a new book called Beyond War, Re-Imaging American Influence in a New Middle East. David Rhode is our guest. David, you mentioned last segment that in the State Department there's analysis by paralysis, and they're afraid to do anything for afraid of making a mistake. Is that the political world we're in that Benghazi becomes a political football used to bash one party over the head the other, and so because of that, nothing gets done?
Yeah, and I would say, Benghazi is an example of the Republicans beating up the Democrats. There was, I think, the decision to invade Iraq was a mistake, but there was all kinds of, when Bush was in office, the Democrats would find any example of money being wasted in Iraq and savage Bush on that front. One example of sort of a different way of doing things, but we're not sort of putting our money behind it, is there was a State Department program that was created after Obama gave this speech in Cairo. I don't know if listeners remember it, but he talked about a new beginning between the U.S. and the Muslim world, and it was a simple program that sent 24 Americans, these were high-tech executive angel investors, to Arab countries, and they would arrange competitions. And they were in Tunisia, and, dozens of young people came in, and what the competition was that they would pitch their business idea, their idea for a new high-tech startup, to this American panel. And the members of the panel were sort of horrified when they realized that the program was so poorly funded that there was actually no prize for the winner in the competition. So in Tunisia, a young woman won. Her idea was a biotech startup. It's a great thing. It will create jobs in Tunisia. And so the members of this delegation pooled their money together. Some of them were Arab Americans from Detroit. And they sent the young woman her great prize for, trying to do the right thing was a 3-month internship in the Tech Town incubator in Detroit, Michigan. To be blunt, we've got to do better than that. That's exactly the kind of thing we should be doing. But this is these are just small and kind of meager and kind of poorly coordinated efforts to be using, we should be using our strengths.
But over the weekend, that story came out that we were sending millions to Afghanistan, and we got absolutely no influence for our money.
Yeah, we've been giving bags of cash to Hamid Karzai, the president of Afghanistan. Another thing I say, and again, if I'm too let's
no, go ahead.
If we don't have a partner, if somebody is not, helping us, then we should stop. We should have reduced our aid to Afghanistan. We're so afraid of a terrorist attack that Hamid Karzai has us over a barrel. We're so afraid of the Pakistani army stopping our drone strikes that we keep giving them money too. And we've got to kind of, not reward this bad behavior. Karzai is leaving office. There'll be a new president of Afghanistan. I think we should fund the Afghan, security forces for a couple years after we leave. I'm hoping for a more effective leader. I know there are people who don't support the Taliban, particularly in the northern part of the country, and they are confident that they can hold on without the Americans. Let's give them a chance. But if it doesn't work, we can't be sort of throwing bags of cash at people that aren't really partners.
But then when we pulled out of Afghanistan after the 1980s, we then let it decay to ultimately being run by the Taliban.
I know. I guess I'm hoping that, and again, I can imagine readers shaking their heads, but, average Afghans, average Egyptians, average people in Indonesia, they want, a steady job, a good school for their kid, and a government that sort of, protects them and doesn't prey on them. And, I'm hoping, and this is sort of the gamble in Egypt too, you let the Muslim Brotherhood actually rule, that when these Islamists run places, most people see that they don't have, that Osama bin Laden didn't have some magic formula for creating jobs and stability. That's what I think is slowly happening in Egypt, and it's a danger if you walk away. But making these guys responsible for the conditions, not the U.S. responsible for conditions in these countries, might help us in the long term.
The book is called Beyond War. David Rhode is our guest, Reimagining American Influence in a New Middle East. David, what are your thoughts on Syria? Where do we go from here with Syria?
It's a very, very difficult situation. I don't think American ground troops should be sent in. And again, I'm trying to think outside the box and, this work through allies idea. I think we should have, it's been 2 years now, I think we earlier should have authorized the CIA and I've met some of these guys in the field to look at the Syrian rebels. It was a more moderate movement in the past, 2 years ago. As the fighting has dragged on and as there hasn't been assistance from the West, jihadists have come in, and they definitely now dominate the armed rebellion. And it's we sort of abandoned the field and left it for Islamists to come in. I think we should arm more moderate members of the opposition if the CIA can identify them. There's this, again, fear in Washington that what if we provide arms and they somehow, end up in the hands of jihadists? A small amount, might end up in the hands of jihadists, but we have to take that risk. Again, we can't be so paralyzed, and tied up in knots because of our own politics that we do nothing. The fall of Assad is a strategic victory for the United States. It will weaken Iran, it will stabilize Lebanon, and it will help Israel. So the Iranians are all in. They are sending weapons and money to Assad. This is a proxy war, and we've got to engage, but without American ground troops.
We don't see Syria on the news. We don't see video. We barely even talk about it. Why is it that it's not a bigger story if this is the new focal point of what's going on in the Middle East?
I think it's partly the success of Assad, and I'm biased as a journalist, but early last year, it looks like the Syrian government sort of tracked satellite phone signals and intentionally shelled a little makeshift kind of media center that the rebels had created. Marie Colvin, a very famous American journalist, was killed, and a French photographer. Syria is the most dangerous place to cover for journalists. It's more dangerous than Iraq was, and that's an effort by, I think, the Syrian government to hide what's happening from the world. It's extremely dangerous. More Syrian journalists have died than anyone else, and I think that's an issue. And I think that Americans are tired. We lost a lot of lives and spent a lot of treasure in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I completely understand the lack of interest in Americans in getting involved in Syria or even hearing about it. I'm just trying to come up with ways, by arming some people fighting Assad, that we can engage that, doesn't require so much American resources or risk American lives.
Beyond War is getting a lot of attention from some interesting places. The book is Beyond War, Re-Imaging American Influence in the New Middle East, David Rhode. David, let me ask you this question. Are you off in left field, or are there people in the State Department who are saying the same things you are, and you have the ability to voice it? Where are these ideas in the process?
I hope I'm not up in left field. And I thank you for asking this question. There's a little office called the Office of Conflict and Stability Operations in the State Department, and it's all about trying to use the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan to have a cadre of State Department people that can go in after a war, let's say there is some kind of settlement in Syria, after an earthquake, that they can help set up the government, I was in Iraq and I saw, American soldiers come into town, and the colonel would be like, hey, Corporal Johnson, you get the trash collection started again. Hey, Sergeant Smith, you reopen the schools. Captain Jones, you get the electricity working. And these soldiers are like, where are the civilians? So it's this small office that's trying to create more capacity to do that. And their other philosophy, which is, again, I love, is to try to work as much as possible through existing local people and local NGOs. And, again, that it's much cheaper and much more effective than instead of having very expensive American contractors and American government employees to try to work through local groups as much as possible, small grants and small projects. And so it's a very small office. Bush tried to do a version of this. Clinton has tried to do a version. Kerry is now supporting it. And, we'll see how they do. It's just a turf war in Washington. Some people in the State Department don't like the new office. There's no congressional committee that funds it, so it doesn't have like an ally in the Washington system. So we'll see how they do. But, there are efforts to change.
The book is Beyond War, Reimagining American Influence in the New Middle East. David Rhode, Pulitzer Prize winner. David, thank you for a fascinating look. Thank you for your work, and we'll talk to you down the road.
Thank you.
You got it. Back in a moment on the Big 550 KTR.